Hello, this is Mike, and welcome to another episode of Urban Legends and Mythology. This episode is going to be a little different. It's more of an introductory episode to a topic or series of topics that I'm going to keep referring back to throughout the course of this season. And that overarching topic is going to be largely spiritualism and how it's played a role and influenced a lot of modern beliefs in like ghost lore and neo-pagan religions. And while spiritualism really gets its start in the 1840s in New York, it really starts to pick up steam during the American Civil War. And I'm going to heavily talk about this war today because this war really did influence the way that Americans view death, and it had a significant impact on the way a lot of Americans view the afterlife, and a lot of those ripple effects still carry on to this very day. But before we drift off into a series of tangents, let's find a beginning and start at it. So without deep diving too far into the American Civil War and the politics at the time, simply put, for the past several decades up until the war, there were all these political tensions, and the main political football was the issue of slavery. And every time a new territory was up for statehood, this political question would be asked, would it be admitted as a slave state or a free state? And what are the state's rights and the territory's rights? And should the people vote on it, or should the government have full say? And you had these series of weak presidents who would just keep kicking that political football down the road until eventually a bunch of southern states decide, well, you know what, we're just going to secede from the Union, and this will no longer be such a contentious separating issue. And of course the Union at the time was like, well, like hell you're going to secede. And then on April 12, 1861, the Civil War officially begins with the bombardment of Fort Sumter. This would plunge America into its most brutal and deadliest war up to this date. By the end of the war, 4 years later, the total death toll would be anywhere from a conservative estimate of about 600,000 up to an estimate of about 1 million dead, casualties including soldiers and civilians. The most brutal of these battles being the infamous Battle of Gettysburg, which left an estimated 51,000 dead in a mere 3-day period. So not only did this war fundamentally change America, it fundamentally changed how we deal with and how we view death, mostly because of the simple fact that at the time, death was all around us. Death affected every family living in America at this time. It's estimated that some 2.5% of Americans were killed in this war, and this was a brutal war. Now, some people will make the argument that this is the first example of kind of modern warfare, but I don't really see it. I would think that you have to go to probably World War I for that. This, I would argue, is kind of America's last hurrah of more of that Napoleonic style warfare, but it was brutal, and medicine at the time was primitive. If you were wounded in the arm or the leg, you were getting that arm and leg literally sawn off. There's no anesthetic, there's no sanitation. If you're lucky, you're given whiskey and a stick to bite down on. And if you're really lucky, you didn't bleed out or die of a massive infection afterwards. Of course, a lot of the deaths weren't from battlefield injuries, they were from sickness, dysentery, fever, malaria, and these diseases would spread through the camps like wildfire, and they didn't care about who was who. Disease is an equal opportunity killer. And then there's simply the aftermath of battle. So after every battle, the ground is just littered with dead soldiers on both sides. And not all these soldiers were dead. Some of them were dying, screaming out in agony. Now, for those ones, the doctors might come and they might take them to the little field hospital or whatever and do what they can. But for the most part, the bodies were just there, and it could take days to bury these bodies. And that's an entire logistical challenge in itself. So a lot of these bodies were just thrown into mass graves, which has always kind of been the traditional way of dealing with your dead on the battlefield. You just dump them into a mass grave. However, this being the latter half of the 19th century, attitudes towards death, especially death on the battlefields, were changing. Because there's that idea that this is someone's son, this is someone's father or brother or whatever. There's probably a widow out there weeping. These people had lives and dreams and hopes. And it was seen as somewhat just disrespectful to just toss them in a mass grave and move on. And it's these families of these soldiers who really change the dynamic because they want their loved ones back. Especially in places like New England, where there's this Victorian kind of romantic idea of a good death. And it was this mindset around death that you take the body into like your parlor and you wash it and you do your little rituals. You lay them out in a wake. You get the casket built and you inter them into the family cemetery or whatever. You allow the family to grieve properly over their deceased loved one, and you give them the headstone and memorialize them. And it's like, well, how do you do that when your loved one's on some battlefield hundreds of miles away and probably dumped into a mass grave? Or for the most part, they're just dumped into a shallow pit and like inches away from where they fell. Or in some cases, they're still just lying on the battlefield right where they fell. The army at the time didn't really have much of a logistical plan. Basically, a lot of the time up to this point, it was up to the families to try to retrieve the bodies. And the families would pay massive amounts of money to have these bodies sent back to them. But basically what would happen is, let's say your loved one died on a battlefield and you got word of his death and you have a general idea of where he is buried at the time. At that point, you would hop on a train, and let's remember this is the 1860s, and at the time, the Union States have a very expansive rail network. That rail network led to the logistics, which helped win the war, by the way, but I digress. So your relative, let's just say it's your father, for example, he'd get on a train, he'd take it basically to where he thought your body was. And throughout most of the war, a lot of the generals were kind of lenient about allowing families to come gather up their deceased loved ones from the battlefield as long as it didn't hinder troop movements or anything. So you would make this long journey to the battlefield and you'd probably be out there with groups of people looking to identify these soldiers. And at this point, let's just say the father does come across his son, which would be a grisly sight considering he's been dead for several days. He then has to put him on a train, transport him back, and then hopefully they can administer a proper funeral. And remember, there's no preservation, there's no refrigeration in these days, so this is probably a very grotesque process. A lot of the times they said that these people that do this, they would fail in their task. So it wasn't always successful, and even till this day, there are still soldiers buried out there on these battlefields, not far from where they fell, who were never identified and just lost and forgotten to time. Now, obviously, throughout the war, a lot of war dead, they would be put on trains and shipped back north, however, for a cost. But this is also around the time we start seeing people looking into, well, how do I preserve the corpse, especially during the summers, if I'm transporting from the south or to the south in brutal heat and humidity. And this all leads to the rise of modern day embalming. And it's really a perk. It's mostly for officers and generals. Those more well-paid, more important members of the military, the ones with the wealthy, connected families who can afford this expensive new process. And the driving force behind this embalming and preservation movement is the undertakers, because let's be honest, the ones who really profit from the war are the local undertakers. And this being America, naturally an entire industry really springs up around the dead at this time. Now, to be honest, there have been undertakers and funeral parlors and coffin makers and stuff as far back as history goes. But during this time, during the American Civil War, it really takes off in the United States as an industry. Because while you still had families grieving and wanting to do all that stuff in their own home like humans have always done, you also get mostly wealthy families who want somebody else to take care of all that stuff for them. And the first step in this kind of death care process is the preservation and transportation of the body. And of course, at this time, you need somebody to build the casket and select the burial plot. And with this brutal war driving this rise in demand for these services, all of a sudden your local undertaker and his assistant, who's probably the guy who has to go out and dig the grave, they are now funeral directors. And this really kicks off the modern funeral industry as we know it today. But of course, that's only one side of it, and that's the side we all know and the side we all think of. However, there is another part of that, and it's the spiritual side of all of this. And the Civil War took place during the spiritualist movement. Spiritualism was on the rise in popularity throughout the 1850s. It does take a small dip in the 1860s when you're surrounded by this like nihilistic view of, oh my god, what's going on? It looks like the world's ending, especially in the South, but I digress. But it does kind of bounce back into popularity after the end of the war, and it's mostly amongst those families who were affected by loss during the war. And this is the first time where we really start seeing the idea manifest in America of the ghosts, the haunted house, the haunted battlefields. Now, ghosts and spiritualism and haunted houses aren't a new phenomena, it's as old as mankind, but after the war, it really comes into its own thing here in the United States. And it really follows the rise of psychic mediums, these people who claim that they can communicate with these deceased loved ones and give those grieving families sort of a sense of closure. And I'm going to talk heavily about spiritualism over the next few episodes, but a basic introduction to it is the idea that there is an afterlife, and when you die, you can either go to that other realm, that afterlife. However, you can also communicate with those that you left behind. This also gives rise to the idea of spirits being trapped in between worlds. So they're here, they're not able to move on to the afterlife. There's a big upsurge in that. And then there's this scientific upsurge into the idea of afterlives or ghosts and etc., etc. And it really is the massive amount of death associated with the Civil War that kind of drives this forward, because pre-Civil War, if you really look at it, you might have some accounts of like haunted houses or ghosts or phantoms or whatever, but after the US Civil War, these accounts explode, because after the war, all of a sudden, everywhere is haunted. Every southern plantation has a ghost. Every battlefield has its own ghosts. Every fort has its ghosts. And it's always these fallen soldiers who are still at their post, who are still fighting. These people who have unfinished business on this earth. And the most famous of these ghostly sites is obviously the battlefields at Gettysburg, which a lot of people seem to forget that Gettysburg wasn't just the battlefields, but like the actual little town of Gettysburg. That town was literally the front line of the war. And there are several accounts from several people that's been out to Gettysburg that say that they've seen phantom soldiers who are still fighting in the afterlife to this day. One account that I heard was this guy who was a tour guide who went out there. Him and his buddies, they would go out there at night and kind of camp and stuff. And they were camping in this area where there was this Ohio regiment. And they're out there and they're talking about the war and they're telling the ghost stories and stuff. And somebody tells this guy, hey, take out your jaw harp and play Dixie. And he does it, and he said that while he was playing that song, he felt this like, almost like a gunshot into his stomach. He said he doubled over in pain and was screaming, and it was like the worst thing he ever felt. And then as he was recovering from this, he heard this ominous voice just kind of out of nowhere saying, you know what you did. And that's just one account of the hundreds, if not thousands of accounts that we see in Gettysburg. Nearly every building that stood there during the time of the war is thought to be haunted, mostly because all of these buildings were used as makeshift hospitals during and after the battle. And obviously, any place on this planet where you have massive amounts of death and suffering, it's going to be affected in a spiritual way. That stuff gets kind of imparted onto the landscape. A lot of parapsychologists and people who study like paranormal phenomenon will say that it's the abundance of limestone in the area that has essentially recorded this tragic event, and it's basically playing it back on a loop. And that's not like a new thing. I've discussed that numerous times over previous episodes where we're dealing with ghosts, for lack of a better term. But like I said, it's post the Civil War when this idea really takes off in America, because these grieving families, they want to know what happened to their sons. They want to know what happened to their brothers. And we have to remember that many of these soldiers were just lost. And these families, they have no idea. They just assume, okay, they died, but I need a sense of closure. And it's these emerging spiritualists, these mediums, who give them that sense of closure. And remember, at the time, this isn't really being viewed through the lens of a religious movement. It's being viewed through the lens of a scientific movement. To a lot of people, spiritualism is a new science. And these psychic mediums, these rituals, these spirit boards, these crystal balls, all this stuff, it's taken seriously. It's taken as scientific evidence. So naturally, the public gains interest and they flock to these people to find out what happened to their fallen sons, their fallen brothers, their fallen fathers. And yeah, there were a ton of charlatans out there at the time. I'll talk about that in a future episode. But for a lot of people, they did get a sense of closure. And one woman who really popularized spiritualism in the United States was Mary Todd Lincoln, the wife of Abraham Lincoln, the president at the time. Now, to be honest, it's not really known if Abraham believed in any of the spiritualism stuff, but it is known that Mary believed in it. And Abraham, being a good supporting husband, he would indulge in it and in her, belief in this idea. For example, when their son Willie or William dies, Mary is completely distraught, and part of the way that her and Abraham cope with that is through a seance where they are believed to have contacted him. And it was, of course, after these seances where she was believed to have contacted the spirit of Willie, she famously started hosting seances in the Red Room of the White House, some of which the president was known to have attended. But it's said that she became enamored with spiritualism in these seances because it helped her get through that grieving process of losing her son. And when word gets out that the First Lady is indulging in these seances, naturally many Americans follow. And these seances, whether they were real or not, the scientific evidence isn't there, but you never know. It did help a lot of Americans get through that grieving process when it came to their loved ones who died in this brutal war. And we just know from a famous account from Lincoln himself that kind of shows that he indulged her in this belief of spiritualism because he would consult her on dreams that he had and weird visions that he had. One famous story was that one morning while getting dressed, he was looking in the mirror and he saw a double image of himself. And while investigating why he's seeing this double image of himself, what's going on with this mirror, he sees that that second image suddenly shatters. So he tells Mary about this vision he saw, and Mary interprets it as an omen. She tells old Abe that it means that he will be elected to a second term. However, something would happen to him. He would not survive his second term. And that prediction turns out to be right because not long after, Lincoln was assassinated. Now, to be honest, that's a popular story. It's been floating around for a very long time, and I don't actually know if it's true or not. It might have popped up in the years after he was assassinated as kind of an apocryphal tale, but I don't really know. However, it's just one of the many ghost stories that are associated with the Lincolns, because it's said that not only does Willie and his other son Tad haunt the White House, but Lincoln also haunts the White House as well, most famously the Lincoln bedroom. And a lot of people who have spent time in that bedroom, like political leaders from around the world, like Winston Churchill, they all state that they saw Lincoln's ghost in that bedroom while they were staying at the White House. And at this point, I think we can really see where a lot of these trends come from. They're coming from this post-Civil War period of death and tragedy. And that really does lead us into the next series of episodes that we're going to get into, where I'm going to deep dive into a bunch of these different topics because this is all really the driving force behind a lot of these topics that we're going to get into. But don't worry, it's not all going to be spiritualism and ghosts from here on out. I am throwing other episodes in there for, like, I don't know, a sense of breaking stuff up. But the next several episodes are going to kind of feature a theme. And on that note, once again, this is Mike. I thank you for listening. Feel free to follow it on the Spotify and all the other social media stuff that's out there, Give it those likes and share it with your friends, and I will see you in the next one.